Strings of Malice. Book 1. Snowflake in an Alley. An old mother nonsense story. Chapter 3. First Stars. Lunreth watched the girl's eyes widen as she stared into their compartment. He had little doubt it was probably one of, if not the nicest rooms she'd ever been in, despite it being as tiny as it was. He thought he'd begrudge the extra expense of the additional passenger, but such feelings had yet to surface. It was already a sum, and he had half planned it regardless. Say what you want about travelling cheap, but Lunreth simply hadn't the will, since he began making his own money, nor the desire to spend the 9-day trip to Monkakoos in the rear compartments of the metal beast. It wasn't so much due to the accommodations. No, that wasn't his gripe with third class. Third class on a train far outweighed the overall state of the barracks aboard the Opportune Vortex. Such a silly, silly name for a ship. It was just that, well, no matter the time of year or destination, hour of departure or related upcoming festival, there always seemed to be an infant on board, displeased with either the movement or the crowded space or the noise, but it always seemed just as determined to let absolutely everyone in the immediate vicinity know their discomfort. Being already a light sleeper himself, Lunreth was grateful that there would be walls between himself and the other travellers once again, however thin, to dampen the sounds. Irinka finally broke out of her stupor and stepped tentatively into the compartment. Lunreth was grateful, and he followed. They had been drawing frustrated attentions, standing out in the corridor with other passengers trying to board and get themselves settled. 2 little boys had managed to squeeze past him during their rush to determine who would be getting the top bunk. But their mother had kept a fair distance from Lunreth. Her scowl did not fade when she was finally able to get through and reprimanded the rambunctious siblings. Thank the gods above and below that the small family was a good 3 rooms away. The conductor in orange stared vacantly at the passengers, only offering short, nervous answers when he was approached. A young, pale thing, it must have been his first ride. Or he was uncomfortable with the somewhat upper-crust clientele he would be looking after during the trip. Either was conjecture that Lunreth didn't have the motivation to linger on, though he did offer the young man a small, easy smile when their eyes met. An older gentleman, with an oiled and pointed beard, tipped his hat to Lunreth as he passed with some 4-legged creature on a glittering leash. The beast seemed to be the result of a wolf and a bird having been minced together, and then poured into the most graceful mould known to man. It seemed quite friendly, and Lunreth couldn't help but smile as it brushed up against the back of his legs when it passed. No doubt its ease around him was the reason its master, in his ornate robes and brightly bejeweled arms, had offered a civil "good afternoon" at Lunreth as he passed. Lunreth inclined his head in turn before he closed the door completely and turned his attention back to his new sibling. It was interesting, watching the same street mouse who had picked a fight with 4 grown men double her size, shrink back from just about everything in the tiny room. He tapped her shoulder and gestured to her once she'd managed to tear her gaze away from the green and brass suite. He couldn't help the teasing smile on his face as he waved, crossed his fingers and then brought the digits up between his teeth. She scowled at him.
"I know that,"
she grumbled, and the man could have sworn he saw her cheeks darken with embarrassment. But he couldn't be certain under the layers of grime that coated her entire being. He set his bag in the cupboard and took up a seat beside the window. Another 20 minutes or so, he sat watching the people on the platform, wondering where they were going and if there would be someone waiting for them on the other side. If those receiving would be happy to see them or not. He liked to imagine they would be. The train whistle blew loudly, scaring the ever-living Resk out of the mouse, and Irinka dropped to the floor the moment the train started moving. Her eyes were instantly wide and distrusting of everything as the great metal beast lurched and started its slow crawl from an area. Lunreth would have found it amusing, if the terror on her face had not drained what little colour there was, until the dirt on her cheeks itself looked more ashen than grungy. He had assumed she had not been on a train before, but this was a little extreme. Was it really so strange to have the ground on which you walk move beneath your feet? Was it really such a novel concept? He supposed it must have been, and wondered if he'd looked anything like that the first time he'd ridden wind. A soft whimper drew Lunreth's attention back to the compartment, and he sighed sadly, pushing the memory aside so he could go to her. Irinka clutched tightly at his hand, and probably would have climbed into his arms if he hadn't started guiding her towards the seats. Without a word, she flat out refused to sit in her own, squeezing herself beside him. He resigned himself to his fate with a smile, turned his gaze over her head and out of the window. Any minute now, the city would slowly drop away, and he was surprised, yet again, when the view loosened his sister's death grip on his arm as she stared in awe. The smothering smog of an area pulled back from the cold of the land, until there was nothing left but an ocean of dark green, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The forest rose and dipped like waves in the rocky terrain that was eastern Milan, and the frost-topped trees glittered silver in the perfectly dismal sunset. While it was less than impressive for him, he couldn't help but notice the small hitches in Irinka's breathing at the sight. She had become entranced, become quite mesmerized by it. He made an educated guess that she was on the verge of crying, too enraptured by too many colors and seeing something as mundane as grass for the first time to care if he saw her weak. He knew the feeling. Sunsets in general were unchallenged in their beauty, but grass? It had been a marvel, near magical compared to the unforgiving sea of sand which his younger self had called his home a lifetime ago. He squeezed her hand, hoping she'd understand. It was all right to cry because of beautiful things, to be overwhelmed, and he wouldn't hold it against her. Gods above and below knew he'd done it enough himself. She squeezed back, but didn't take her eyes off the pastel colors darkening on the horizon. Without speaking, as was his way, he only let her hand go long enough to point out the first star to grace the evening view. She named it Tamara. He could not tell her he knew the name, and that she was both closer and further from it than she knew. They sat that way for hours, as pale pink gave way to deep indigo, and far too many floating jewels to name. He only carried her to bed, once the weight of her head on his shoulder told him she had drifted off.
He was right, you know,
you murmur softly to your sister when Old Mother Nonsense pauses her tale with a declaration that she almost forgot to feed a pet she was watching over for a friend.
About?
Your sister asks, taking 2 cookies from the plate and popping both into her mouth at the same time.
About third-class trains,
you clarify. Your sister scoffs.
Don't pretend you know things. We've never been on a train.
It really is disgusting that she doesn't bother swallowing before speaking.
We did so,
you insist.
When you were still very small, we came on the train from Lily to Taki. You cried the whole way. I will ask Daddy when we get home, and I will know if you are lying.
Your sister raises a warning eyebrow and waves another cookie at you, dropping crumbs all over the pillows between you.
As you will.
You sigh and glance up when you hear a soft creak above your head. Old Mother Nonsense must be keeping the pet up there, but any attempts to make out what it is are drowned out by your sister's insistence that she will do as she said.
And then Daddy will cane your hide for telling lies.
That isn't a lie. You mourn to yourself, because you will probably get a caning for telling her. It was supposed to be a secret. Why you thought she would keep it is beyond you.